chat box on the side. You can use the chat box on the side if you have questions, and if you have them during the seminar, we'll hold to the end, and then we'll get the questions to Niala. So welcome, Niala. Just a quick introduction of Niala. I had the pleasure of meeting Niala back in June at a climate resiliency workshop in Barbados, and she gave a really nice presentation on some of the work that she's doing in Grenada. But just a bit about Niala. Niala is a climate adaptation specialist. She works for the Nature Conservancy's Caribbean division. She holds a degree in urban and regional planning with a focus on environmental planning, community development, and land use. And she also has a BSc in architecture. Just some of her background, Niala possesses years of targeted experience in both built and natural environment, particularly in the fields of project management, environmental planning, and implementation of nature-based solutions, so NBS, using various initiatives in coastal communities. Currently, Niala leads the AWE project in Grenada. AWE stands for At the Water's Edge. So basically focusing in on enhancing coastal resiliency in Grenada. So with further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this week, Niala Frederick. Thank you, Niala.
Okay, great. Thank you, Chris, for that great introduction, and Erin for that great introduction, and Chris and the team from Trent. Thank you for having me this morning. I'm very excited to be here, as you can tell. So without further ado, I would get into my presentation.
Chris or Doug will make you the host.
Okay. Can I proceed?
Doug, can you handle that? There we go.
Okay. I'm not sure what you're seeing from your end, so you need to tell me. Can you see my screen?
Yes. Yes, now we can.
Okay, great. So good morning again, everybody. As Erin mentioned, I am the climate change project manager for TNC's Eastern Caribbean program. So I've been working with the Nature Conservancy for quite a number of years, and we work throughout the Caribbean, we work throughout the globe. But in the Caribbean, we have targeted offices, and for the Eastern Caribbean, our focus is all the OECS countries, the independent OECS countries, and Barbados. And if you know the Caribbean, I'm going to be talking a lot about the Caribbean, but most of the examples and the talk that I give, they're very applicable to small island states and what is happening. We share a common theme that we are island nations and we're surrounded by water. We depend quite a lot on the water for our livelihoods, for tourism, etc. And as you know, we've been impacted significantly over the years, and now we're definitely feeling the pressure of what is happening. So our vision with the Nature Conservancy, particularly the Caribbean division, is having a resilient Caribbean where both nature and people can thrive together. And if you know the Nature Conservancy, you would know that a lot of our interventions are based on using, of course, nature. So we do a lot of mangrove restoration, we do a lot of coral reef restoration, we work with fishers, looking at sustainable fisheries, etc. So I mentioned briefly that the Nature Conservancy, the Caribbean division, we have 17 countries, territories, and these are our offices. I am based in Grenada all the way here, and our head office is in Miami. But we do quite a lot of work on the Eastern Caribbean program. As I mentioned, we're looking at what is happening in all the independent OECS countries and Barbados. So just a little bit about the Caribbean, and I guess a lot of these stats are applicable to other small island states as well, with the Caribbean being home to 44 million people. I'm sure this might have gone up in recent times, over 12,000 in fish and other marine species, and we have 10% of the world's coral reef. So you can imagine the impact that has on our economy, because as I mentioned previously, a lot of our economies, we depend on fishing, but we also depend on tourism, and we have 12% of the world mangroves. So when we're looking at the impacts that are being felt on coral reefs, the threats to coral reefs and mangroves, the Caribbean is actually smack bam in the middle of what is happening, and we are definitely feeling the brunt of climate change and the impacts on our coral reefs and mangroves. So I'm going to talk about our priorities for the Nature Conservancy, but these are also priorities that I guess other small island developing states has as well. For the Nature Conservancy in the Caribbean, our priorities are to ensure that we have healthy oceans. I mean, without healthy oceans, as I mentioned, with the fisheries that we read, the fishery sector, there'll be no coral reefs. The fishers, there'll be no fish. So the ocean is quite central to not just our work, but also the lives of persons in small island states. Another of our priorities is to safeguard against the impacts of climate change. And if you know what is happening in the Caribbean right now, particularly in, and I'm going to talk quite a lot of about Grenada because I'm based in Grenada, but particularly in Grenada, when you look at our coastal communities and you see the impacts, you have sea level rise, you have storm surge, you have severe coastal erosion, you have homes being threatened, you have lives being threatened, you have livelihoods being threatened. This has definitely been one of our priorities, and we could definitely not walk away from this, learning to work with nature and working with these communities to make them a lot more resilient to the impacts of climate change, particularly these coastal communities. And then, of course, we're looking at protecting coral reefs. Again, as I mentioned, without these coral reefs, we would not have healthy oceans. The fishers, there'll be no sustainable fisheries. We would not have these coral reefs, which is actually our first line of defense, particularly for our island nations, because you have the waves breaking on these reefs and then they're rolling ashore with less wave energy. So of course, we'd have our shorelines really protected. We'll have less erosion and we'll have stronger communities when you look at what is happening, particularly along the coast of these Caribbean nations. So I would give you an example, a case study, and then I can talk a lot more about what we're doing. But when we look at the threats, as I mentioned, of course, we have climate change. We're looking at 1.5 and COP is just around the corner. We've been hearing about 1.5. We've been hearing about our oceans, the temperatures getting hotter. In the Caribbean, in Grenada, we've been seeing coral bleaching that's been happening quite frequently right now. We've been seeing diseases to the corals as well. As I mentioned again, the coral reefs are our first line of defense. We have fringing reefs, we have barrier reefs, and without that protection, we would not be able to have our shorelines. We would not be able to enjoy our beaches. Again, that leads to livelihood opportunities. I mean, without the corals dead, dying, you have less fish. You have the fishers having to go further out for their catch. You have the coastline eroding, and you can see from this picture, without the corals, again, I mean, tourists come there to really enjoy the beaches, but to snorkel and dive as well. So there are a number of things that are linked to healthy coral reefs and are linked to mangroves in the Caribbean, in small island states. And without these, you have this trickle over effect that impact quite a lot. And when you look at, if you spill it higher up and you're looking at our nation's GDP and all of that, it really takes a toll. So for us, it is critical that we get this right. It is critical that we actually work with communities to ensure that they understand the impact and the impact of climate change, but the impact that they also have on the climate. And they understand that the role that nature plays in actually helping to reduce some of that, helping to correct some of these issues as well. So I'm just going to touch briefly on a case study, some of the works that we're doing in Grenada, in the Grenville Bay, which is really applicable to small island states, because I'm sure Grenada is not the only island experiencing this. When I speak to colleagues in the Caribbean, and I actually did an exchange to Guam a few years ago, and they are experiencing similar issues. So yes, we're Caribbean nations. Yes, we're separated by vast oceans, but at the end of the day, our issues are really similar. And if we don't get it right, and we don't get it right now, we'll definitely have problems. Well, I mean, we're definitely having problems now, but we'll have more problems later on. So Erin mentioned that I lead one of the projects. It's called At the Water's Edge, and it's literally working with communities at the water's edge. They really do live at the water's edge, to ensure that they understand the impacts that are happening in their lives and how they can enhance their resilience using nature. So from this photo, you can definitely see what I mentioned previously. There is actually, can you see my pointer? Yes, I hope
Yes,
so.
yes, we can.
Yes,
Yeah.
we can.
Great. So there's actually a fringing reef all the way out there, and that reef has been dying over the years. I mean, it's not so able to sustain much live coral cover right now. And this is one of the impacts. So you have all this heavy wave energy coming ashore. It's eating away at the shoreline. I mean, as I mentioned, homes are being threatened, lives are being threatened, livelihoods are being threatened. And I'm pointing all the way out here because this is where the land used to be previously. So they've lost quite a bit of their shoreline over the years, predominantly because of the coral reef. But interestingly enough, this is a mangrove that is here, and you can actually appreciate the resilience of this mangrove. So in years gone by, persons would have used a lot of the mangroves for charcoal and that sort of thing to fuel their homes. So you have two issues. You have overfishing, but you also had persons cutting mangrove trees. And another issue that is happening right now is that you have development. So you have tourism on one hand, but with tourism, you have some of the prime areas, and these areas, they consist of mangroves and other species that are holding soil and the coast together, but then you have these being raised for development. So would have had persons using mangroves previously, then you now have development, so that is affecting mangroves. And then you also had overfishing. And in this particular community, which is really interesting, they actually used to use, I would call it doing coral picking. So they actually used to go out and use the lime to actually help with building of houses. So there was a lime kiln in the city, and they would actually reap or harvest the corals, crush it, and use it in the house building. So you have a number of issues that would have been affecting the coral reefs in this community, but also affecting the growth of the mangroves, which would definitely affect what is happening right now. So the area is called the Grenville Bay area, and you have 4 coastal communities. It's on the eastern side. And these are just some of the situational analysis. So it's high in terms of exposure to sea level rise, etc. And it's low in terms of their adaptive capacity. A lot of persons who live here are fishers. When you talk to them, I mean, they say they've been fishers all their life. That's what they know. They don't want to do anything else. But then from all these stats, you can appreciate some of the things that have been happening. I mean, they lost 6 to 5 centimeters. They're losing that every year. And over the years, it's been adding and adding, becoming more significant. Here you can see that the live coral cover is less than 10%. And based on the science, once you go under a certain percentage, it's really hard to regenerate. And it's really hard for the reef now to function as it should, which is the first layer in terms of protection to the shoreline. And these are just some of the pictures. I mean, as I mentioned, there's critical infrastructure being threatened. You have all the wave energy coming ashore, and this is a snapshot of what the reef looks like. So we would have worked with the community to develop what is called a living edge plan. So working with them to understand what is their vulnerabilities and how they think they can address it. This is the plan. This is what we call our Bible now for interventions, because we're doing a number of interventions in this community, and we're actually using this. So these are some of the interventions that they looked at: stabilizing the shoreline, doing a hybrid approach using green and gray, so like a living shoreline. They looked at doing water quality retention ponds. And I should pause here as well, because I mentioned that a lot of persons are doing fishing, but this is a big farming community for Grenada as well. They provide most of our source of vegetables for the island of Grenada. So they're actually known as the breadbasket of Grenada. So we have a lot of farms in the hills. So when we're looking at our interventions, again, we're not just looking at coastal, but we're looking at a ridge to reef approach, actually working with the farmers in the hills to ensure that their fertilizers don't get down, because you could actually be addressing one issue, which is the issue on the coast and the issue with the reef. But then if you don't address what is happening in the hills, then you actually spinning top in mud, as we say in Grenada. So they mentioned that they need retention ponds because Grenville floods. But when you look at the purpose of the retention ponds as well, it's quite critical because, as I mentioned, you have all the farms, you have all the fertilizer. If you do the retention pond and you have the slow layout, we would have worked with the farmers in the hills doing dams and other things, looking at the fertilizers they use, how that affect, what they can change, what they cannot change. We would have worked with persons living there as well and looking looking at the septic tank system. And Chris gave a talk a few weeks ago about water quality. For us, that is really important, because if we don't get this right, no matter what we do out here, and you have poor water quality, it doesn't make sense. So they mentioned that they wanted to do retention ponds, again, greening on the shoreline, doing some mangrove restoration, doing some nice boardwalks, working with the community to do some shoreline restoration as well. There are areas where you have severe coastal erosion, so strengthening that using a hybrid approach of green and gray, but again, throughout, using nature as much as possible to get some of the solutions and to provide that protection. And this is a pilot that we would have done with them. So looking at the reef and the live coral cover, I mean, it's almost non-existent. So the thought for this is to actually build the height of the reef back to where it was. You would have the waves breaking on this. So now you would have a reduction in the wave energy reaching the shoreline, and you would have less erosion. Now, this is very green. And to make it green, what we would have done is actually seed this with coral. So we have been we did a pilot of this. Based on our studies, we actually had to do 300 meters, but we only did 30 meters to model, to understand what is happening with the pilot, whether or not this can actually work, whether or not the materials are right, etc. And now we are poised to actually begin the full build out, which is actually 300 meters to provide that protection that coastline needs. We would have also done mangrove restoration as well. As I mentioned, they would have been removing the mangroves over the years. So just working with the community. And interestingly enough, we've worked with the communities, but we also use the schools. I mean, it's never too early to start working with the small minds to impress upon them the importance of nature. So they would have outplanted this in 2017, and I would actually show you photos of what is happening right now with these mangroves. But just using a two-prong approach for these communities, working on the reef to make sure that the height of the reef is okay, so you have the wave energy breaking, less wave energy coming ashore to reduce. But also when you see this with corals, I mean, we're talking about a coral reef and we're talking about 300 meters, with this actually accreting over time, and the corals would actually come over, crust over. You have crustless coralline algae covering these structures, and you have the corals coming over and they're regenerating quite quickly. The thought is that at the end of the day, you would walk away with a man-made reef, and you would have the protection to the shoreline with the mangroves and other hybrid solutions. So this is just what would have happened in this area. As you can see, that there's been a lot of sediment, there's been a lot of land loss. There's also been a significant number of mangroves lost as well. This is the reef we are working with. From that pilot, we would have actually used fishers. So when we talk about interventions in the communities, one of the things that we really like to do is actually use a lot of community members. So we actually use fishers to install this pilot, but we also use fishers to monitor, to help us monitor as well. And from that, they were really excited about the corals that they saw regrowing there, but also about the fish that they saw as well. I mean, they had stingrays, which for them is a novelty, with stingrays coming this far. They actually had a tiger shark, I think it was, and they have a plethora of fish life right now in the bay. This is just us modeling the wave energy to understand what would have been happening, whether or not if we put structures this way, how would that provide the protection to the coastline? If we lengthen it, what would that do as well? So we had to actually model this before we started to do anything. And these are just some of the objectives. So it had to be able to, these structures that we were putting over there on the reef, they actually had to be able to reduce at least 80 to 90% of the energy, because as I mentioned previously, that wave energy coming ashore right now, because the coral is no longer there, is really wreaking havoc along that coastline. It had to be able to promote natural growth with the crustless coralline algae. The corals that were seeded on that, they had to be able to grow over and make sure that they grow. Again, using community labor and using costs, making sure that this is cheaper and less than gray infrastructure to make the case for hybrid interventions, nature-based solutions. This is just what the structures look like, and we would have stacked them one on top of the other. I'm not sure what is happening here. I seem to have a freeze. Okay, and I'm just going to show a short video. I think I still have time. Okay, I'm not sure why this is not. Oh, there it is. Please tell me if you can hear as well.
It's frozen right now, Niala, but it might just take a couple of seconds to upload to our
Okay.
systems. There you go.
Can you hear now? Okay.
I actually born in Grenville. I knew that beach probably since I was in Pampas. It hurt my heart to see how it had been deteriorated. I know in the past there was a nice beachfront where you can play cricket, you can play.
My connection is terrible for this.
It-
Okay.
You can run, but it's so sad to see it is no longer there. So I'm pleased to see that a project is started that will help it not restore it to its old glory, but at least prevent further erosion.
And what's been really fun is to watch a very diverse group of people come together, Conservancy staff, our partners, the community in Grenville, to first envision a resilient future for Grenville, then design a set of action that would help the community be less vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and begin to implement some of those actions.
This project that we're currently doing came out of almost 3 to 4 years of quite a bit of planning and community work in order to develop an approach to reduce wave energy and reduce coastal erosion that's been eating away the beach here for the last several decades.
Both of these baskets are designed to encourage lobster, octopus, and other creatures to inhabit them. They're also designed to be heavy enough to withstand the forces of a hurricane. We would envision over time for the reef, in a sense, to absorb and grow over these structures so that eventually you won't even know they're there.
So we've seen that the shoreline is eroding. Everybody here knows that the shoreline is eroding. That's really because the level of the reef is not blocking wave energy the way it has in the past. Mangroves have washed out. You can see plenty of evidence of the coconut trees that have washed out. So re-establishing some of the biological barrier along this shoreline is just as important.
So these are red mangrove seedlings. We put them in the nursery, ready for transplant.
The mangrove helping us a lot by planting it and for it to grow up to keep back the beach. And everybody in the community satisfied and they put a hand to help.
The picking of the seeds and the caring for the seeds and the transplanting and the nursing and the nurturing is done by people from this community.
So there are many communities around the world that face really this exact same problems that Grenville faces. What's really exciting is that what's happening here in Grenville can really serve as a model for other small island developing states around the world.
Most of the people in this area rely on the sea for their livelihood. Many of them are into the fishing industry. And because of that, the protecting of the reef is so very important in sustaining their livelihood. And with the initiative, what you're going to find is that people are going to benefit in all aspects. And so this means a lot to every person.
Here we are able to bring people together with nature, making them more resilient, being able to adapt and combat the issue of climate change and even disaster hazards that would affect the community at the water's edge.
Okay. So, I'm not sure how I get. Okay, let me just. I'm just gonna move on from that one and but I think I lost. Okay, here we are. Okay, great. So you would have seen the video, you would have heard me talk. This is just a snapshot of one of the little structures that we would have put out. As I mentioned, it was done by the fishers. You can see the new growth in terms of the corals. And of course you can appreciate the fish. I think for them, the amount of juvenile fish that they saw within the bay after so many years of not seeing this has been really excited, because they were talking about having laws to ensure that persons don't go in and fish and all of that. So they were really excited as well to ensure that this succeeded. And these are just some of the proposed solutions to make this happen. So looking at doing a coral nursery on land, using different techniques, and I would talk about that later on, because you have the threats, but you also have to understand some of the solutions as well, and what we're trying to do with the communities to address that. And these are our mangroves. I mentioned that they were planted in 2017. This is actually an old photo, but these mangroves are really tall right now. You can appreciate the roots, red mangroves, they're coming over. So they're actually going to be doing what they are supposed to be doing. If you know much about red mangroves and the roots, is that these big prop roots, they actually come over and they sediment themselves in the ground. But most importantly is that they trap dirt. So you have land accretion, and you have that shoreline being stabilized. Another important thing from these mangroves is that they serve as a breeding ground for juvenile marine habitat, juvenile marine life. So we're actually getting two benefits, or even more than two benefits, from these mangroves, because when you look at the bigger countries and you talk about carbon sequestration to reduce our 1.5, then there's actually a lot from that. Unfortunately, we don't have vast mangrove forests, but we assume that the little that we're doing is actually working and contributing to that as well, reducing that temperature. So these are the mangroves. They were planted by the school kids, and it's really interesting that when the school kids go back, they're really excited. Oh, I planted this one, I planted that one. So in terms of some of the stuff that we're doing, as I mentioned, in the Caribbean, small island states, particularly in Grenville, and I'm talking quite a lot about that because we work quite a lot in Grenville area. You have the reef dead dying, you would have overfishing, you would have persons doing reef harvesting, you would have had severe coastal erosion because the reef is dead dying. So you've had all these coastal vegetation that would have held the shoreline together as well. From that two-prong approach, they are no longer there. Persons would have used it for securing their lives, firewood for cooking, that sort of thing. You have development right now, but because of the erosion, you would have had that toppling. So in terms of protection for the ocean, because that is really critical, really significant if we are going to do anything at all. We do quite a lot of marine managed areas. There are a number in Grenada. There are a number, as I mentioned, we work throughout the Eastern Caribbean. So that is critical as well. Caribbean countries right now, they're looking at protecting their shoreline. So you have by the year 2030, they would have protected how much miles offshore. Some persons would have looked all the way to their ECZ. You've had persons delineating around, I'm saying persons, but countries actually delineating around the islands as well. What you would have is no-take zone, looking at doing like a revolving door for that. So if in 2 years you designate this as no take, in the next 2 years you actually, persons could actually fish there, and then you have another area that is designated as no take zone. So there are a number of initiatives. You're looking at sustainable fisheries. Do you use fish nets? Do you use fish pots? What are the materials made of? Allowing, as I mentioned, the no-take zones, but just allowing the marine life to grow and flourish. There are areas that you would have snorkeled before. There are areas that persons, you put that designated that you cannot anchor your boats there, because the destruction that the anchors do on the coral reefs as well for yachts. You cannot anchor there, you cannot fish there, that sort of thing. And as I mentioned, promoting sustainable livelihoods through that, working with fishers, working with the communities, understanding the needs of the fishers, but working with them to ensure that they understand that if you overfish, then you would have a problem. If you take the juvenile fish, then you have a problem. If you're looking at the parrotfish, and then we know what the parrotfish does for the reef, if you're going to take all of that off the reef, then you have a problem as well. So working with them so that they really understand some of the threats that are man-made, but some of the nature threats as well, and understanding how they can work with us and work with their communities to address that. I mentioned sustainable fisheries as well, reducing on the fishing pressures, and of course that would have a spillover effect on the reef. The solutions, climate change solutions, strengthening our coastline, looking at the mangroves, looking at the type of mangroves you plant, looking at where you plant that, looking at development along the coast as well, looking at a number of things, looking at the interventions, whether or not you want to do hard gray. You know, if you hard gray, you would be limiting access to the beach. You would be, sometimes depending on how you do it, you actually increase the problem versus addressing the problem. Do you do hard grade? Do you do a hybrid in some instances? What do you do? But make sure for us that the use of nature, so the use of mangroves and beach vegetation, beach re-nourishment as well, that's really critical for us. And protecting the freshwater sources. As I mentioned, there's a ridge to reef approach with what we're doing, but because of that ridge to reef approach, we're actually able to address the issues that are happening in the hills before they happen, before they come down and affect what is happening on the coast, in the water. Working with the farmers, whether or not they reduce on whether or not they reduce on their fertilizers, whether or not they do dams so you have less water coming down, working with homeowners, whether or not they have faulty septic tanks, faulty suckerways, how they can address that. Just looking at a number of factors. Interestingly enough, we would have done a study a few weeks ago. And one of the things is that the hairdressers and the products that they use once they get into the water source as well, that is an issue because it comes down. Looking at, when I mentioned sustainable livelihoods, one of the things we look at is working with women in these vulnerable communities, but looking at sea moss farming. In the Caribbean, we like sea moss. In Grenada, we like sea moss. I mean, they use sea moss, they make sea moss ice cream and sea moss punch. But if you know, one of the benefits of sea moss is that it actually helps to clean the water as well. So ensuring that the water quality is top notch. So at the end of the day, when you do that ridge to reef approach, you're actually addressing not just the coastline, but you're addressing all the way down and looking at sustainable livelihoods. And that is tied into that as well. And then, of course, there's the coral conservation. So I mentioned quite a lot of mangroves. You would have seen some of the stuff that we're doing. We're rebuilding damaged reef. You have the threats to the coral reef. You have sea temperatures rising. You have bleaching. You have anchoring of yachts in certain areas. And these anchors, they break the corals, they damage it. You have storm surges. When you have hurricanes, etc., sometimes these coral reef break as well. And because they're a first line of defense, of course, you have a spillover effect. But looking at coral reef restoration, there are a lot of groundbreaking techniques right now. We're actually working with partners to do microfragmentation so that you actually cut the corals. I would not get into that, but you can definitely do some more research on that. But the smaller you cut the bits is the faster they regenerate. And because we're going to be doing a whole 300 meters for that reef restoration, we definitely need a lot of coral fragments for that. So just looking at various innovative techniques and making sure that we get it right, making sure that we work. For us, it's important that we work with the fishers, because they are the ones, they are the ones doing the fishing, they are the ones doing the diving, but they are the ones who actually see a lot of what is happening out there. So ensure that we work with them, we build their capacity. We've been doing quite a number of trainings with them right now on coral reef restoration, actually. So they actually have quite a bit of knowledge of what to look for when they go out there, but also when we talk about sustainable fishing practices, they actually know what they should do, when they should do it, where they should do it, etc. So I've come to the end, but just wanted to wrap up and say that in the Caribbean, in the small island states, I mean, this is real. We're actually experiencing it. I'm living it. I'm actually heading back up to this project site in a few minutes once I'm done here. But you can actually appreciate what is happening. The communities literally living at the water's edge, they are really suffering. And just working with them so that they really understand the threats that the coral reef face, understand the benefits for the coral reef, but also understand the benefits from beach restoration as well, and beach vegetation, and the importance that mangroves play. So when you have that two-prong approach, and you have the reefs doing their first layer of protection, and then you have the mangroves doing their second layer of protection, when they really understand that and they build their capacity, their vulnerabilities would really definitely be reduced, and they would definitely enhance their resilience, but enhance their resilience to climate change using nature.
Niala, thank you. That was excellent.
Thank you, Erin.
Great
So I would
presentation.
for questions.
I'll start off if that's okay, Niala. Thank you.
An easy one, Chris.
Yeah, excellent presentation. Working in nature-based solutions, we have a specific kind of vocabulary that we use, but maybe that's not familiar to everyone who's on this call. So can you just maybe explain the difference between gray, green, and hybrid approaches to nature-based solutions?
Okay. Good question, Chris. I mean, I was just talking, assuming that everybody was on board with us, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So we have gray green, as I mentioned, and then you have nature-based solutions. And I know over the years, one of the things has been to make the case for nature-based solutions. So when we talk about gray green, a lot of our small island states over the past years, they would have done stuff like seawalls. They would have done a lot of riprap along the coastline. You have groins, and you have the groins in different shapes. So as you travel along a lot of the small island states, particularly in the Caribbean, you would see a lot of that dotting our coastlines right now, because as I mentioned, the entire thing is vulnerable. Now, what we're doing, and what a lot of other agencies are doing, but what for us, the community was really quite excited about marrying the two. So in some areas where you have significant erosions, then we definitely use gray. So we use things like crib walls. In some areas, we definitely have to use like riprap and groins to go out to get that protection. But then when we talk about the hybridness of that is the green. So doing like a live-in shoreline approach, you're marrying the two together. So you have crib walls and you have groins, but you also have that mangrove restoration. And not just mangrove restoration, you have like beach revegetation as well, because persons really like to enjoy the beach. I mean, I love the beach as well. And there's nothing better than going and you sit under a nice almond tree, or you sit under a nice grape tree and you pick that and you eat. So just working with them to marry the two, doing a lot of that beach revegetation with mangroves, but grapes and almonds and coconuts. And then of course, using some of that. So when you marry the two, the live-in shoreline approach, that you would have that gray green. And another thing from that, what we found was really interesting, because we did like the cost benefit analysis. For us, is actually cheaper doing the gray green versus hardcore engineering. And as I mentioned previously, I mean, when you do that, if you have a beach and you do hard engineering, so you do a wall, I mean, it's really hard for persons to go in and access the beach and enjoy that quality of life. So you have gray green and you have hardcore gray, nature-based solutions, the hybrid. I hope that explains it.
Yeah,
there's a lot of literature. I can definitely send links if persons are interested.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions in the sidebar here. One of them is, you mentioned microfragmentation, your approach to growing coral. I've read that is up to 50 times faster than natural regeneration. Can you say a little more about the role of this technique in your work?
So I'm not an expert in that. We have a whole division for that. But yes, they actually grow a lot faster the more you cut them, apparently. So for us, once we heard about that, and TNC has a whole coral lab in the USVI right now, St. Croix, and they're doing a lot of that because they do a lot of coral restoration there. In Grenada, we're just starting, so it's very novel for us, but we're actually working with a consultant. And because we need so many corals right now for restoration, using microfragmentation, it actually works a lot better for us. And interestingly enough, because we're on the east side, so you have all this wave energy, we're looking at slow growing corals, the hardy types like the brain corals, that sort that can actually withstand the wave energy. So microfragmentation would actually help us achieve our objectives a lot faster, because once we get them growing faster, we'll be able to outplant a lot more and have them growing very quickly. So the length of time taken that they would take in a nursery normally would actually be speed up.
Okay, great. Thank you. The next question, they thank you for a very insightful presentation, but they ask, were there any government stakeholders, central or regional, or any legal frameworks that would ensure the project continues and hopefully upscales?
So I talk quite a lot about the Nature Conservancy, but one thing I forgot to mention is that we're actually doing our interventions with government partners. So we work with the Ministry of Environment, we work with forestry, we work with agriculture. We work quite a lot with partners. We work with the Grenada Red Cross, because we're not only looking at working in the reef and working with the on the shoreline, but you're also looking at providing them with the skills that they need, the community. So you have disaster risk reduction training and providing them with, you have safety at sea for the fishers. So once we would have had all these partnerships forged, the government on their hand, they are working on legislation. And we actually have a project right now, which is looking at policies that the government have and making sure that they're infused, I'm saying infused, but infused with a lot of the language, so that further and future interventions would definitely be looking at doing an EBA approach or nature-based solutions approach versus gray. So that is the government. We're actually working on them with policy right now. I know most of our projects, and because they're a really significant partner for us, most of our projects, they actually go through them and they address, like, tick off certain priorities for them in terms of their sustainable development goals. When they're looking at reporting on biodiversity, they can actually look at our project and report on numbers as well. So we're definitely working with them on the policy aspect. Now, when we talk about scaling up, there's definitely, because this is a pilot, and Grenada, but not just Grenada, but the Grenville Bay is not the only area in Grenada that is experiencing this. We just want to make sure that it works well so that we can move to other parts of Grenada and other islands within the Caribbean. So that's the scaling up part. But when you talk about capacity, so that at the end of the day, we walk away. As I mentioned, we've been working quite a lot with the communities. We've been working with the fishers. We've been looking at the gender as well. So not just the fisher folk, but also looking at their wives in the community, making sure that they get the required training. So at the end of the day, when we walk away, they would be able to carry on. And one of the interesting things is that we would have started working with the schools as well. And a lot of the schools within the area, it was really interesting that one of the kids said, oh, I should tell my dad, don't fish parrotfish anymore. And the dad was actually a fisher, but just making sure that the next generation sort of understands. So when we walk away, build their capacity as well. When we walk away, we have the government, and then of course we would have the communities that are able to take this on. We have community groups as well that we work with, so that they would be able to take this on and be stewardship. So you have the policy aspect being addressed by the government, and then of course you have the interventions being addressed by the community. And once you marry the two, we anticipate that the interventions being done in this area would really be holistic, so that you address all the issues together.
Great, thank you. There's a couple more questions, but is there anybody that would like to ask a question live before I move to the next question in the chat box? Okay, so the next question, how are you accounting for sea level rise as part of your mitigation strategies?
That's a really interesting question. So we would have done quite a bit of studies and we would have modeled. I mean, there's only so much you can account for because our climate is changing. But one of the things in our studies is that we actually did the models to look at 2 meters sea level rise. We looked at the 100-year flood and all of that as well. So with our interventions, we actually took that into account. So if our sea rises by 0.5 meter, how high do we need to put these structures? If it goes by 1 meter, how high do we need to put these structures? We're also looking at the tides as well. So you have the high tide and the low tide and what happens as well. So you don't want your structures too exposed, but you also want to ensure that when the sea level rises, that they're actually able to function as they should. Now, along the coastline, as I mentioned, we're doing quite a number of interventions, and that is significant. I know the government has programs in one of the areas. They actually were able to move a community that was significantly impacted, move persons from along the coastline, and now we're actually working with them to stabilize that shoreline. Again, looking at sea level rise. If a 1 meter comes, will this work? Will it hold up? Will it stand? 2 meters come? I mean, we definitely cannot go to 5 meters, but working with them to ensure that at least we try to get what the models say might be happening right now and might be happening in the near future, like 30 years from now, and how the interventions we're proposing, whether or not they would withstand that in the long run.
Thank you. I guess I have one question. You really highlighted the importance of community involvement, community education. And as most people know, small island developing states are communities in themselves. How do you enforce some of these solutions? For example, in your red mangrove slide, you had fences up. So I'm sure that people still want to use mangroves for firewood. How do you mitigate or educate so people aren't utilizing these for other like, for example, as for firewood?
So interesting enough, we actually put the fence around that photo that you saw to actually give the mangroves a chance to survive, because you will have animals wandering through and trampling on the mangroves. So we actually had to remove that fence, but it was just to give it an opportunity to survive. Now, with our community engagement, I mean, they don't use the mangroves anymore for that. There was another project where they would actually be doing beekeeping and that sort of thing within the mangroves, because apparently these mangroves, you get some really nice honey from them. But it all goes back to a lot of community engagement and ensuring that you have community buy-in. When you do your community engagement, as I mentioned, you have to build their capacity, make sure that they really understand the importance that the mangroves play and the beach play and the coral reefs play. Make sure that they understand that yes, we know that you would need to use and sometimes you overfish, etc. But if you do too much, then you would not have that benefit that you have. And making sure that there is buy-in, because without buy-in, we would be lost right now. They are actually, as I mentioned, we use the fishers, but we also use them not just to put out the structures, but we use them to help us monitor it. And they came back and like, oh my God, we need tougher laws to ensure that persons don't go and take our juvenile fish. And then you use these community members again. I mean, they are the ones doing the mangrove restoration. So they want to ensure at the end of the day, when we walk away and they are left with it, that their interventions actually work and they can actually see the benefits from this. So for us, it's critical that at the beginning, we get it right with the community engagement and we ensure that we work with them so that they really understand what is happening in the process and their role in the process.
Perfect. Thank you. Are there any more questions? We have maybe time for one more. Chris Metcalf?
Well, for those who have never seen a parrotfish, maybe you can tell us what they do to help the reef survive.
Interesting. Oh, you put me on the spot right now.
Yeah.
So the parrotfish are the really nice, pretty fish that you see. I know in the Caribbean, persons really like. I mean, they grow quite big, but what they do is that they actually break up. So that's where we get a lot of the sand. They help to clean the reef as well. So they get rid of all the the bad algae on the reef. So then you'll have nice corals, pristine corals, but then they also break up so that the bits, so that you can also get that nice sand that you get on the beach when you go on the beach. So they actually serve a lot of purposes, and that's why for us it's critical that you try to leave them out there as much as possible, because the mere fact that they are helping clean that reef so that you can have the corals growing nice and all of that, and the spillover effect from the corals, that is really significant and important. And we've been trying to drive that home for the fishers. It's really hard because persons seem to really like parrotfish. They're like, oh my God, that's it's one of the juiciest fishes. I mean, I don't eat fish, but they're really into that. So it's really interesting working with them to ensure that yes, you can take, but you don't take the babies, and you leave some of the big ones as well, so that they can actually help do some of the work that they need to do on the reef.
I read an estimate that something like 20% of the sand on a beach has been through a parrotfish at one time, but
well, you can never tell, because I mean, you know what the sand is.
Great, good question, Chris. I guess that kind of concludes our seminar series for today. Thank you, Niala, for presenting. I'm sure that your email will be associated with this presentation somewhere along the way if people would like to email you questions or maybe get some more information from you. Next week, October 12th, we continue the series with a talk by Kim Waddell and Gregory Ganell from the University of Virgin Islands in St. Croix, where Niala is getting her coral research from. The talk next week is Reducing Resilience on Non-Renewable Energy in the Caribbean. So I hope to see everyone next Wednesday. So thank you everyone for joining.
Chris, thank you for having me. And I put my email in the chat for everybody.
Thank you, Niala.
excellent.
All right.
Thanks, Niala. All the best.
Thank you, guys.